So speaking of children, the story that we're going to share, or at least the first half of it, that we're going to share today is one that perhaps you learned as a child, perhaps you didn't. But I know that when I was the age of the children that just left, and maybe a little bit older, one of my favorite stories in the Bible is the one that just happens to show up in the Hebrew scripture part of the appointed lectionary, which means that priests and pastors all over Santa Fe, all around the nation, all around the world are preaching about David and Goliath today. It's one of those passages where you go, what in heaven's name are you supposed to be preaching about? Especially for supposedly a peace-loving church like the United Church of Christ. Well, today I'd like to invite us to consider the first part of the story. I don't know about you, but when if you heard this story as a child, I was enamored of this little guy going up against this big giant. Now maybe that's because I'm the youngest of 4 in the family, so I grew up with giants. They were always a foot or two taller than me, it seemed like. But this story I like this story. I like David's courage. I like the fact that he was the youngest. And I like the fact that he went out and did what he had to do. But as I've gotten older, the part of the story that really impresses me is the part that Ben's going to share with us. The lead up to David's confrontation with this giant. Because I think that tells us something that we really need to know in this day and age. So pay attention, if you will, especially to the very last paragraph of what Ben's going to read, about how King Saul thought David should go up against Goliath dressed in Saul's armor, because that's what you do to take on giants who are also dressed in armor. But David had other ideas. Let our hearts and our lives be open to the reading, hearing, and understanding of this ancient but powerful word.
The story of David, Goliath, and King Saul from the first book of Samuel. Now, the Philistines gathered their armies for battle. King Saul and the Israelites gathered and encamped in the valley of Elah and formed ranks against the Philistines. And there came out from the camp of the Philistines a champion named Goliath of Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span. He had a helmet of bronze on his head. He was armored with a coat of mail. The weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of bronze. He had greaves of bronze on his legs and a javelin of bronze slung between his shoulders. The shaft of its spear was like a weaver's beam, and his spear's head weighed 600 shekels of iron. And his shield bearer went before him. He stood and shouted to the ranks of Israel, "Why have you come out to draw up for battle? Am I not a Philistine, and are you not servants of Saul? Choose a man for yourselves and let him come down to me. If he is able to fight with me and kill me, then we will be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then you shall be our servants and serve us." When Saul and all Israel heard these words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. For 40 days the Philistine came forward and took his stand, morning and evening. Then Jesse said to his youngest son David, "Take food to your brothers and also to King Saul." David rose early in the morning, left someone in charge of the sheep, took the provisions, and went as Jesse had commanded him. As he greeted his brothers, Goliath came up out of the ranks of the Philistines and spoke the same words as before, and David heard him. All the Israelites, when they saw Goliath, fled from him and were very much afraid. David said to the men who stood by him, "Who is this uncircumcised Philistine, that he should defy the armies of the living God?" David's eldest brother, Eliab, heard him talking to the men, and Eliab's anger was kindled against David. And he said, "Why have you come down? With whom have you left those few sheep in the wilderness? I know your presumption and the evil of your heart, for you have come down just to see the battle." David said, "What have I done now?" It was only a question. When David's words were repeated to King Saul, Saul sent for him. David said to the king, "Let no one's heart fail because of him. Your servant will go and fight with this Philistine." Saul said to David, "You are not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him, for you are just a boy, and he has been a warrior from his youth." David said to Saul, "Your servant used to keep sheep for his father, and whenever a lion or a bear came and took a lamb from the flock, I went after it and struck it down. The Lord, who saved me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear, will save me from the hand of this Philistine." So Saul said to David, "Go, and may the Lord be with you." Saul clothed David with the king's armor. He put a bronze helmet on his head and clothed him with a coat of mail. David strapped Saul's sword over the armor and tried to walk in vain, for he was not used to this. Then David said to Saul, "I cannot walk with these. I'm not used to them." So David removed them. Then he took his staff in his hand, and he chose 5 small stones from the wadi and put them in his shepherd's bag in the pouch. His sling was in his hand, and he drew near to the Philistine. May God add blessing to the reading, hearing, and understanding of this word.
There's so many entry points into this story that one could go on, as old Puritan preachers did, for 2 or 3 hours in a sermon. Don't worry, I won't. But I invite you to consider this story over the next stretch of time. Take it home, take the bulletin home. Consider where you come into the story, what speaks to you in the story. Maybe you're the older brother of David, who's been out on the battlefront, in the encampment for days, if not weeks at a time, hearing the taunts of this giant person and knowing that you couldn't take him on and neither could any of the people around you. And so when your smart aleck little brother shows up, has left the sheep behind, you're not real pleased with him. The Bible is nothing if not honest about family dynamics. Or maybe you are David, the one who's been out tending the sheep, the one who supposedly has been chosen to be the new king of Israel, but nobody knows it yet. And his dad has told him to leave the sheep behind, bring some provisions both to his brothers and also to the king. And when he gets there, the guy can't keep his mouth shut, right? This Philistine comes out, this huge guy who's got 125 pounds of armor and sword and shield and helmet and everything else on him. And he's taunting your people, and they're not doing anything. And so that little pipsqueak decides to speak up. And then his older brother immediately gets upset with him, and the younger one says, "Hey, well, you know what? I just asked a question." I tell you, I did not have to move to Santa Fe to start channeling my older siblings, nor my mom, nor myself, nor King David. Talitha Arnold has been known You can ask any of my 3 older siblings to have used that expression. What did I do? I just asked a question. It's a great story. Maybe you feel like Goliath. Maybe you feel like Goliath, that big giant who knows that nobody's going to take him down because he's so big and he's so well armored. Maybe you feel like Saul because you're not the one going out to face that big giant. And this little pipsqueak of a guy is. So you want to load him up with all your armor to make sure that he is well protected from whatever might happen to him out on the battlefield. But you also have in the back of your mind, why am I getting displaced by this guy? What's going on? So there's all kinds of entry points into this story. But I would like to invite you to consider that very last image. That last image of Saul, in fact, loading up David with his own armor, his own sword, his own shield, and the little kid clonking around, knowing that he's going to be, it's not going to work for him if he goes out to face Goliath in all of that armor that doesn't fit. Instead, he works with what he has. His knowledge of the fact that without all of that armor, he'd done a pretty good job of protecting those sheep. He'd taken on lions and bears to keep them safe. Finding a faith, finding a wisdom that fits, and working with what you got. Another story about David, not from the Bible, but from Renaissance Italy. In the early 1400s, the church leaders and city fathers of Florence, Italy, decided that they wanted to adorn their great cathedral with 12 marble statues of the disciples, all the way around the outside of the cathedral. So they started commissioning sculptors to work on it. But 40 years later, only 2 sculptures had gotten finished. And over the course of those 40 years, the city leaders had changed, the images had changed, the visions had changed, and there were not a disciple, of the two sculptures, not one was a disciple. One was Joshua, the great warrior leader of the Hebrew people, and the other one was Hercules. Some city leader came in and thought matching up Christian stories or Jewish stories with mythological figures would be a good idea. So they had Hercules and Joshua. And then the city fathers in 1464 commissioned another sculptor to do the 3rd statue. And it was supposed to have been one of the disciples, finally. The sculptor that they commissioned was a well-known person by the name of Agostino. And he wanted his statue to be the biggest of all. So he sent away to Carrara, which was the quarry about 80 miles away, for the biggest piece of marble he could possibly get. Huge, just huge. 10, 12 feet. I mean, when you think about how heavy marble is, and they're bringing it down by mule cart or human labor or whatever, 80 miles. Shows up in Florence, and Agostino begins to work on it. He sort of roughs out some legs, but then about a few weeks into the job, he quits. He quits. It happens. And so this huge piece of marble lay in the courtyard of the cathedral for decades, for another couple of decades, actually. And then the city fathers decided again to hire someone, commission someone, a sculptor by the name of Rossellini. He quit after 3 days because his complaint was the marble was inferior. It had too many flaws in it, and he wasn't going to take a chance with it. So for 40 years, from the time that Agostino had first been commissioned to make some kind of statue, until 1501, that big piece of marble just sat unfinished in the middle of everything. 1501, new city leaders came along. Things don't change over the course of many decades and centuries in human life. New city leaders came along. They wanted to get this thing finished. And so they did a contest, commissioned, and the person they commissioned was a 26-year-old sculptor who had just come from finishing up an incredible sculpture in Rome called the Pieta. If any of you have ever seen it, it is this wonderful, wonderful image of Mary holding the dead Jesus, fully draped. The finesse of all of that, just this fine carving to show not only Mary's face, which is exquisite, but also to show the way in which the cloth and the way in which the body drapes. Fine detail all the way through. Michelangelo was hired to do something with that big slab of marble. It's unclear as to whether or not the city fathers wanted David or Michelangelo wanted to do David, but that's what he decided to do. But deciding to do David presented a whole host of problems. Number one, there'd already been all kinds of sculptors, whether in marble or in bronze, like Verrocchio, who had already done David after he'd killed Goliath. And according to at least part of the story, he chopped off Goliath's head and is holding it up. There were other famous sculptors who'd already done pictures of David at the moment of victory, standing with a sword, Goliath's sword, and Goliath's shield over the dead Goliath. So why did Florence need yet another David? Then there was also the problem that the piece of marble, if you were going to do a full human image, the piece of marble was very narrow, where the previous sculptor had tried to rough out the legs. And so it meant you had all these problems of a big torso on legs that might not hold it. And then the third problem was, in fact, the marble was inferior. Scientific evidence and scientific research in the 20th century showed that it was a piece of that the statue of David has all these flaws in it. So you couldn't do the kind of fine carving that is a part of the Pieta. So what do you do? Well, Michelangelo worked with what he had. He worked with what he had. And the rest, as they say, is history. If you've never seen a picture or never had the opportunity to see the David in real life, go online later on today. There's all kinds of the Smithsonian, the Britannica, all kinds of places have multiple images of this fantastic, wonderful, awe-inspiring work. One of the main things that Michelangelo did was not to try to copy what others had done before, not to go to the dominant imagery of David as the great victor having chopped off Goliath's head. He did an entirely different David. David just before, after he portrayed David after David had said no to Saul's armor, taken it all off. And before he goes out to meet Goliath. He has his sling over one shoulder, and down, almost hidden in his hand, are the smooth stones. And he stands resolute. He's not looking at what he has just done. He is looking at what he needs to do. And the face of David is phenomenal. It's just sort of this clear, confident gaze. His brow is furrowed. He knows that he's in for a fight. but he has something within him that none of the other Davids have. Some kind of confidence, some kind of strength, some kind of knowledge that he's not alone going into that battle. Now, I don't know whether or not Michelangelo ever read Hebrew Scripture, or whether or not he'd ever heard the story that David said to Saul, I've already taken on, I may be a punk of a shepherd boy, but I've taken on bears and lions to protect my sheep. I can do it again. And the hand of the Lord will save me from the paw of the bear and paw of the lion and this big hunk called Goliath. Michelangelo, like David, worked with what he had. Not somebody else's faith, not somebody else's interpretation of what David was supposed to represent, but his own deep understanding. What does any of this have to do 500 years later from Michelangelo, 2,500 years later or more from David? I'd like to put forward to you today that we are in a time when we also need to find a faith that fits. We need to dig deep and remember why it is we come to a place called the United Church of Christ. Why it is we want to be part of a faith community in the Christian tradition. Why it is we want to follow in the ways of Jesus the Christ. Because you know as well as I do, we are living in a time when there's all kinds of people saying all kinds of things about what does it mean to be Christian. And unless you and I know and take on a faith that fits what we know, what we believe in, what is our motivation for even coming through the doors this morning, those other voices, those other images of what Christianity is about, what Jesus Christ is about, what this whole Christian faith that we share, part of which we share with our Jewish brothers and sisters and part of which is out of Christian Scripture, other people are going to define that for us. We have to find the faith that fits. We have to work with what we've been given. And my hunch is that many of us in this room right now were given a faith of Christianity, an understanding of Christianity that is vastly different than the wider culture is saying what Christianity means. I did not grow up in a Christian church that said God hated gay people. It didn't talk a whole lot about gay people, but at least it didn't say God hated them. I didn't grow up in a Christian church that said a woman doesn't have the right to over her own personal authority in her body. I did not grow up in a church that condemned immigrants or refugees. The church I grew up in was on the front line of civil rights and working for peace. I would never have chosen to be a pastor or even just to be a Christian if that had not been the case. And you and I need to make the case for Christianity. We cannot just say, oh, you know, it's so bad and people are using the Christian church and it's Christian nationalism and all of that. Yes, it is. But as the prayer that we just began the service with asks us to pray not for easy lives, but to be stronger people. More grounded people, more faithful people. People who know what faith it is that we've been given. what faith it is we seek, even if it is our very first time in the Christian church. For me, at least, that's what this story of David getting ready for whatever comes next is all about. It's what the story of Michelangelo dealing with an inferior piece of marble that somebody else already worked on, with all kinds of images of what David was supposed to be, following his own soul, his own heart, his own understanding, and creating something brand new that has outshone all of the other portrayals of David. What are you willing, what am I willing, what are we willing to stake our lives on as people of faith in this particular community? Because the stakes have never been higher, at least not in my lifetime. And unless we start saying what it is we believe, and not just leaving it up to the pastor or the pastor, but what we believe, what you believe, then Christian nationalism and all of the perversions of the Christian faith will have the day. It may feel like we're up against Goliath, but so was David. It may feel like we're up against insurmountable odds, but so was Michelangelo. To pray not to have easier lives, but to pray to be stronger people. Stronger people. And if you need some guidance in that, I invite you to do two things. One is to think back in your own life, just like David thought back, well, you know, okay, I got this big guy out there, but I've taken on lions and tigers and bears. Oh my, no, just lions and bears, no tigers. I've taken on these and I've been prevailed, and I've prevailed. Who has helped you in your life prevail? Who taught you something that you want to hang on to of this Christian faith? Remember them. Channel them. You live in Santa Fe. Go down to the depths and channel them. We're surrounded by a whole communion of saints, said the letter to the Hebrews. Call them in, just as our Native American brothers and sisters call in their ancestors. Somebody invested in you and in me. We need to make good on that investment, my friends. So remember who surrounds you. And secondly, if you're looking for guidance, I invite you to seek out the writings of Reverend William Barber, whose quote is at the very front of the bulletin today. A Disciples of Christ pastor from North Carolina, African American. He has now just recently been appointed in the last 2 years to the new Center for Public Theology and Public Policy at Yale Divinity School. Prior to that, he was best known for starting what he called Moral Mondays, where he gathered other clergy and lay leaders at the North Carolina legislature every single Monday throughout the whole year to witness for issues of economic justice, racial justice, gender justice, all the various kinds of justice things that are important, whether in North Carolina or any place else. He went on to start the equivalent of the Poor People's Campaign, only he called it the Moral Campaign. He has become a leading Christian voice in our time, and if you don't know of him, Google him and find out. But one time he wrote what you find at the beginning of the bulletin. He was going to be on this is from a book that he wrote, telling about an experience he had on the Bill Maher show. Bill Maher being one of the leading atheists of our time, who was always talking about, no, he doesn't believe in God, yada, yada, yada. This was Barber's response. Not long ago, I was a guest on Real Time with Bill Maher, with one of America's most prominent atheists. Wearing my clerical collar, I realized that I stood out among the guests. So I decided to announce to Bill that I, too, am an atheist, wearing a clerical collar. he seemed taken aback. So I explained that if we were talking about the God who hates poor people, immigrants, and gay folks, I don't believe in that God either. Sometimes it helps to clarify our language. I invite you to take that part of the bulletin and put it up on your refrigerator, or put it in your wallet. Or if sometime when you confront, or when you're with people who are saying, oh, this Christian stuff is all just nationalism, it's all yada, 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 just take it out and read that to them. Work with what you have. You now have a quote. You now have the elevator speech. And if you don't start using it, and we don't start using it as a church, then it won't be heard. We have a great communion of saints, whether it's David or Michelangelo or the people that we name in our hearts and our souls, who have helped us learn how to tell the truth about this thing called Christianity. It's our job in this generation, no matter what your age. It's our job in this time. It's our job to speak the truth about why it is we even come through the doors on a Sunday morning. I don't believe in that God that's out there. It's being put forth by all kinds of people. The God that supposedly hates gay folks, doesn't like women, believes only in military might, doesn't give a hoot about the poor. I don't believe in that God either, and I don't believe that you do. And together, we need to work with what we have, which is a story of a God whose love is greater than our fear and hatred, whose hope is greater than our despair, and whose ways of life overcome all of our ways of death. That's a God you can work with. That's a God to give your life to.